What was it like discovering Joe Hill?
Um, it was so exciting because it really just came about from this innocent place of reading a short story collection that I hadn't heard of the guy that wrote it, but me and the CEO at the time, Ted Adams, were both reading this book, and we're like, there's something about these stories that just feel kind of like I was talking about before, where it's like on the surface, if you describe the high concept, you're like, oh, I know what that story is, and then you read the story, you're like, oh no, he did something totally different with this. And so it sort of had a almost a Neil Gaiman-ish quality to the way he would tell his stories. And so then you start thinking, well, is he another Neil Gaiman? Is he a guy that could jump from prose to comics as easily as Neil seemed to do? And so we just reached out to see if he first wanted to maybe adapt some of his stories for comics, kind of trying to be wary of the fact that he's a prose writer, so he's got a day job. So if we just do adaptations, it won't be a huge burden to his schedule. And then Joe said, well, I'm not all that interested in that, but I have this idea for some new things. And so we ran these new ideas by us. And the one that really stood out was this one with the big creepy house and the magical keys and all of that. And so going from this kind of high concept with this new writer that we'd never heard of to then, seeing what the book could become, and then, learning Joe's secret identity down the line became this fun bit
You
of,
didn't know.
didn't know at all. No.
Welcome to the Comics Cube, everyone. Here I am with Chris Ryall. How are you?
I'm great. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
The first question I ask everyone who first comes on my show is, why do you love comics?
I love comics because they've always been in my life. I had an older brother who sort of gave me two things. He gave me an appreciation at the time for the band Kiss, and he gave me a love of comic books. And those things sort of imprint on you when you're young, and almost for the same reason. The comic books were filled with colorful, costumed, larger than life characters, and I mean that's kind of what the band Kiss was for me at the time, too. And so those things have just always been a part of my life. It's funny. I was talking to Roy Thomas recently, and Roy Thomas was a writer that, I read a lot of as a kid, and I was telling him there were things that Roy wrote that I probably bought for a quarter with my allowance that 40 years later still mean the world to me. And it's just crazy that you can get sort of a lifetime of positive memories and good feelings for just such a tiny amount of money. It's sort of astounding to me. And so comics have always been there. Like as soon as I could read, or even before I could read, I was flipping through them and appreciating them. And I just can't imagine a life without them.
Do you have a particular favorite comic from when you were younger?
The first,
something that really sparked it.
The first series, the first comic I ever read was an old issue of Fantastic Four that my brother's some friends down the street had. And so I'd go over there as like a 4 or 5-year-old, and I'd just be flipping through this comic over and over again. And it was a comic where it was Fantastic Four 130. So Jim Steranko did this cover. It was a Fantastic Four fighting the Frightful Four. So there's 7 or 8 colorful, very interesting looking characters just on the cover alone. And I would go down there and just flip through this comic repeatedly. And finally, I just got tired of having to go to the neighbor's house to look at this comic. And so one day I just kind of rolled it up, put it in my back pocket, and scampered on home. And so I didn't go down a life of crime, but what I did do is sort of develop right then an abiding love of the Fantastic Four. So that's kind of been one that's just always been with me, I think, because it was my first.
They ever catch you?
No. Well, what's funny is I haven't been in touch with those guys for, I don't know, the better part of 4 decades. And one of them reached out, oddly enough, through social media and said, hey, I looked you up and I found you. And I said, man, I got to come clean. And I've actually still got the comic. Here it is. If you want it back, I'm happy to mail it back to you. And he's like, I'm so happy to know that it gave you, decades of enjoyment. So thanks for fessing up, but no, please keep it.
That's an interesting issue. It's almost like you liked it when covers had multiple characters on the cover. Yeah.
I mean, it told you such a story in itself. It's like there's this giant rocky character fighting this guy made of sand, and somebody that's stretching impossibly fighting somebody with living hair and a guy that's on fire, and like when you're a little kid, you see that, like there's just no resisting it.
Um, did you have any particular comic or creators that made you want to make your own?
Yeah, kind of the same two guys throughout my life. George Perez and John Byrne were both the creators who, they're the two artists that I really noticed that styles could be different and distinctive, and you could tell something was better than something else even before you really understand that different people are making the different books and who's who and what styles are and all of that. There was something about, one of the other earlier books that I read, um, was George Perez's first run on the Avengers. And he was, what was he, 23 at the time he drew those? And so he talks about them like they're very raw and he didn't know what he was doing and on and on. But even then, there was something as I'm flipping through the books, would notice a panel or a page where something just looks better. It just looks more impactful. It just sort of stands out to you in a way that other comics don't. So it was one of those things where you're sort of recognizing a flavor before you can really taste it, but you know that you like it. And so those two guys have kind of always been my sort of superhero ideal. I it's either one or the other. Like if you name a Marvel character, I'm probably going to picture their version of that character.
In what about writers? Do you have any particular writers you looked up to, tried to emulate?
Yeah, I mean, writers. Roy Thomas was an early one, and again, like I didn't really know writers back then. I just knew kind of what I liked. But when I went back and paid a little more attention a couple years later, Roy Thomas stood out to me. Bill Mantlo stood out because he wrote just about everything. Every time there was a need for a fill-in or a writer to come in at the last minute, Bill Mantlo seemed like he was there. He had long runs on other childhood favorites of mine, like the Hulk and Rom Space Knight. I mean, when I discovered Frank Miller's Daredevil, I was probably 10 or 11 when I first read that. And it was mind blowing to me that it just felt so adult and so cool. And it kickstarted this like decades long fascination with ninja and sort of martial arts and all these things. And so it was people like that told stories that mattered in the moment, but also kind of made you want to know more about the things they were writing about. Roger Stern is another who I always held in
Yeah.
high regard as far as just being just a classic superhero comic writer. Um, I mean, I only experienced Stan Lee's early works like through reprinted books, but as a kid, like those really mattered because the dialogue was just so punchy. It was as punchy as the art. It was also just big and expressive and bold, and so all of those guys together just sort of like congealed in my mind. And so when I first tried writing comics as a kid, it was always with those kind of guys in mind. Like everything had to be big and impactful and cool and sort of tough talking. Um, which is all before I discovered Chris Claremont. And then you're like, oh, maybe they could be a little more cerebral or a little more dialogue heavy too. And then I think it was sort of all distilled down for me, like when John Byrne started writing Fantastic Four, that to me was like one of my very favorite artists, writing in a way that really appealed to me, and writing a book that was a favorite of mine was just kind of like this combining of all these different ingredients that I just loved.
Roger Stern is a creator that sneaks up on you, I think, because I'm like, when I was a kid, I never articulated that he was one of my favorite writers. But then one day I like looked up, all of these stories that I loved as a kid, and they still held up. And I realized they were all written by Roger Stern.
It's wild when you think about, people talk about John Romita Jr.'s first run on Spider-Man being so great. And, he did this amazing Juggernaut story. Like, yeah, Roger Stern wrote that. Roger Stern wrote this amazing Avengers run with John Buscema and Tom Palmer. And Roger Stern wrote this amazing Superman run, and on and on and on. Like he did such a good job on so many books in ways that I don't know if it wasn't flashy or what. There are certain guys that kind of just, you knew they were reliable, but they didn't necessarily sort of achieve that superstar status that others did. And I mean, whoever knows why that is, but yeah, he's a guy that even now his stories really hold up well.
So what did you think of the fact that John Byrne and Roger Stern only got 8 issues on Captain America?
I know it kind of makes me crazy. I've gotten to know Byrne really well over the last decade and a half, and so when I go to the New York Comic Con, I'll take a night and go out, hop on the train and go out to his place in Connecticut. we'll have dinner. And so I'm constantly just picking his brain about old stuff, probably to the point where he's like, could you stop talking about Alpha Flight, Captain America and everything? But I kind of can't. But so I talked about that and the plans that he and Roger had going forward and what they wanted to do. It makes me crazy because there are so many things that I think the editor-in-chief at the time, Jim Shooter, did well as a writer, and he sort of helped elevate Marvel and a lot of their talent in ways that I think really sort of maintain the foundation of that company. But there's also those kind of instances where it's just like, had you just taken a lighter handed approach, maybe we could have had these great longer runs like Stern and Byrne on Captain America. And so, yeah, just knowing that those things don't exist but could have is always frustrating. Speaking of that, there was an ad that ran in old like 1980 Marvel comics that was like Doctor Strange coming, from Roger Stern and Frank Miller, and like that never happened. And so it's one of those great lost books that we almost had, and it's like, oh well.
What a team that would have been, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I mean,
yeah, good.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think both guys, went on to do a lot of other great work. I think that might have been either before Daredevil or sort of coinciding with when Daredevil went from bi-monthly to monthly. And so Miller just had to back off because of schedule. He wasn't driven off of that one by any editorial reason. It was just like, but still just knowing that it was announced and it was that close to becoming a reality is like, damn it, we really missed out on that.
Miller himself like sold Daredevil so well, right? Because I'm like, the thing that I always point out to people who say it's super realistic, I'm like, well, it's got ninjas and they come back to life.
Yeah.
But he sells it so well that everyone thinks it's a straight crime book.
Yeah, totally. Well, and the great thing about that too is he made me aware of guys that I didn't become aware of for years. But then when I did, it was like, oh, right, that's what he was doing in Daredevil. Like there's so much Will Eisner in the way he would treat some of the pages and the covers. And, he would do the titles on pieces of paper that were floating through the air while Daredevil's running through the city, and just things like that are like, oh, Will Eisner was doing that in the Spirit. I just hadn't experienced the Spirit. Or when you read Ronin, you're like, oh, he's doing Lone Wolf and Cub. And so it kind of makes you more inclined to check out these things that you maybe, didn't otherwise know about at the time. And so it was great that he not only distilled that into the books that he was making, but also made you want to expand your horizons too.
Yeah. And also with Frank, his first Daredevil story that he wrote, Elektra, that is a straight up riff off of Sans Serif.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He'll admit it. I don't feel bad saying it.
Well, yeah, and I think it's just there weren't such easily accessible Spirit books at the time, and so a lot of us didn't know any better. We were getting our Marvel comics from the store and didn't know that he was bringing all those influences into the book. So it's kind of exciting when you find that out.
What about Alan Moore? Like, what was that like?
I didn't read Swamp Thing until it was done and collected, which is crazy. I also didn't read Watchmen until it was released as a trade. Like I just didn't pick up the individual issues, and I don't know why. So like my first exposure to Alan Moore was the Superman annual that he did with Dave Gibbons, or like the Green Lantern Corps backup stories he did with Dave Gibbons and others. And so I would read these other bits of Alan Moore, but didn't really experience kind of the greatness of Alan Moore until a little later. And like for the life of me, I don't know why I didn't pick up Watchmen. Like I was buying just about every Marvel and DC and First and Pacific and all these other comics at the time, and I didn't pick up Watchmen. And I don't know, you have these blind spots that just somehow didn't land for you, and I don't know what it was. But later on when I finally read the whole thing as a book, you're like, this is mind blowing. Same with V for Vendetta. Like I didn't know about that until later on. And yeah, I mean, it's a high watermark. Like everything he does is a high watermark in comics. Like his first few years on Swamp Thing are just still some of the best comics ever done. But yeah, I wasn't really reading DC too much at the time. And so I would pick up the occasional annual or special issue, but I just didn't pay that much attention until after Crisis.
Were you collecting New Teen Titans off the rack?
That was the book that led me pretty much from being just a Marvel kid to DC. And what's terrible about it is the issue that I picked up, like the first Titans issue that I got was issue 16. And the only reason I picked it up at the time was because it promised a preview of this book called Captain Carrot and the Amazing Zoo Crew, which is like this goofy, funny animal comic by Scott Shaw.
Yeah.
But that was why I picked up that book. Otherwise, I wasn't really aware of it at the time. And then when you read the comic around that Zoo Crew story, you're like, oh my God, Teen Titans is just as good as the stuff George Perez did at Marvel. And so then I went back and collected every bit of it I possibly could, and it immediately became a just favorite of mine.
Yeah. So I'm gonna ask you, because I know you've been talking Marvel this whole time, right? But I'm gonna ask you both as a fan who was there at the time and how you see things now, to choose between two things. Claremont and Byrne Uncanny X-Men or Wolfman Perez Teen Titans.
Oh my God, that's like killing one of your two twins, you know, that you that you just love equally. I don't know, man. I probably reread Titans more regularly because it reads faster. You know, Claremont X-Men, you got to kind of really dig into it because there's a lot of words on those pages. But I think I go with X-Men. I just, that Claremont, Byrne, Austin team was doing things that were just, I mean, that are unequaled in a lot of ways today. Like, just you look at those pages that those guys are drawing, and I'm amazed that whether it was bi-monthly or monthly, like that they were able to turn out that kind of work and just do so much in you know, so few issues. Like the Dark Phoenix saga now would be probably a 24-month storyline. You know, Days of Future Past was 2 issues, and it's just every issue is just groundbreaking and mind-blowing and still just so beautiful to look at. But I hate having to pick between those 2 books because I love Titans equally.
Yeah, my answer to that, and I don't know if you agree with me, is I think X-Men works better as a standalone because you don't really get the full impact of Terra unless you know who Kitty Pryde is.
Yeah, I can see that, because I think that's exactly right. Why we were so blown away. Like, no, the cute young plucky character is the one that we're pulling for. She's not the one who's in bed with the guy who's 5 decades older. Like, that was just so skeevy and disturbing because it was just so unexpected. And it's because of like all of our adoration of the innocent, like Kitty Pryde like characters. You're right.
Another choice: Marvel Superhero Secret Wars or Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Oh, Crisis is so much better.
Even
so
at the
much
time?
better. Yeah. I mean, I liked Secret Wars because it brought a lot of Marvel characters on to you know, into one battlefield, but it wasn't written by the people that had been writing those characters month after month. And so instead of Chris Claremont writing X-Men, you got Jim Shooter's version of Chris Claremont's X-Men, and it didn't quite feel the same. And I mean, I think Mike Zeck and John Beatty are a great art team, but there is no comparison to, you know, the stuff that George Perez was doing with what Dick Giordano and Jerry Ordway as his inkers on Crisis. I recently reread Crisis, and it's still just so, I don't know, impactful in ways that Secret Wars wasn't. You know, I mean, Spider-Man got a new costume and She-Hulk joined the Fantastic Four, but like, I remember Iron Man got this big fancy new armor, in like 2 panels after he's back on Earth, he's like, what's this crap? And throws it away. And it's like, all right, well, that series didn't really resonate across the universe in the way that Crisis did.
Oh. And also I think Mike Zeck, I love Mike Zeck, but I think even he'll tell you that that's not his best work.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure he's pretty blown away by the fact that Spider-Man page was sold for $3 million, when I think his Spider-Man work, his Captain America work is, you know, heads and shoulders above Secret Wars.
Any page from Kraven's Last Hunt.
Yeah,
any page is
and
better.
you know, thinking of the comparison between those 2 series, I think kind of like when a movie sequel is terrible, it makes you retroactively dislike the original a little bit more. Like Secret Wars 2 makes it harder to like Secret Wars. You know, like, do we need an issue where Peter Parker taught the Beyonder to go to the bathroom? Like, if Secret Wars 1 is what led us to this point, then that series doesn't deserve the acclaim that it got.
God, can you imagine though if that scene, if Secret Wars 2 was like drawn by, I don't know, Mike Allred, and now with the same exact script, now all of a sudden it's a comedy.
Yeah, totally. Well, so I don't have you seen there? Sal Buscema did like 7 or 8 pages of Secret Wars 2 #1, like full pencils that I guess Jim Shooter looked at and said these aren't action packed enough. I want a new artist. So then he went and got Al Milgrom, who I think most people would agree that Sal Buscema's layouts are usually a bit more, maybe more dynamic than what Al did on that book. But yeah, he was fully the artist on that series, and then just got replaced. But when you see the pencils that are out there, floating around on the internet, like they were good pages.
Yeah, because Sal is a good storyteller.
Just a great storyteller, absolutely.
In 2001, a movie came out that is the fifth of a trilogy called Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. And I was a big fan of the View Askew universe at the time. And on the website, in the movie, there's a website called moviepoopshoot.com.
There is.
And in 2002, that became a real website and you were running it. How'd you get involved with Kevin Smith?
It's such a stupid story. So, and I don't think it happens now because there's just too much of everything on the internet. But so 2001, I was like a technical writer. I was writing car brochures and car ads and just very sort of, for me, creatively unfulfilling work. And so at night I was writing comic reviews online, just as a way to sort of involve myself in comics in some way, because pitches I'd sent to publishers hadn't quite broken through or anything like that. And so Kevin read a review I wrote of his Green Arrow, the book that he did with Phil Hester. And I reviewed the first issue and I didn't quite get it. Like, the character was talking very anachronistically. He was talking about the police in the same way that he did in like the Denny O'Neil 60s comics. And I was just like, this just feels so dated and weird to me. And so the review didn't shit on it, but it also didn't love it. And so Kevin wrote to me directly and he's like, hey man, you're way off on this comic. And I mean, he was right. Like, had I waited and seen that, it was actually a Green Arrow plucked out of time. And so he was talking like that very specifically because he was kind of a dated version of the character and all of that. I would have seen that. But at the time, in the immediate, like the first issue didn't really work for me. And so Kevin told me how wrong I was. I defended that and said, well, it's my opinion. Like, my opinion can't be wrong. It's my opinion. And so we were just going back and forth over email. And it was like kind of heated, not in a mean way, but just, he was very adamant that I was way off base. And I was very adamant that, man, it's just my opinion. But then along the way, a couple weeks in, we're still doing this. And I would go home and tell my girlfriend, hey, I'm still fighting with Kevin Smith. He sent me another nasty email. And she'd be like, why is he wasting time with an idiot like you? I'm like, I don't know, but I don't know. It's kind of fun. And it's kind of getting not jokey, but we were kind of playing around with each other. And I don't know, it just kind of got more amicable. And so finally, this was right around the time the first Spider-Man movie came out. Kevin had just moved to LA and he's like, hey man, we found out like over the course of these emails that we had a mutual friend. So he's like, why don't you grab him and let's meet up and, go see the movie and grab lunch and we could just, whatever, meet in person. And so I did that. And we got to talk and I figured that was my big Kevin Smith story. And then not too long after that, he invited me over to his house. I had a copy of the Birds of Prey pilot episode. They did that series that I don't even remember if it ever aired.
They aired for 8 episodes.
Okay, thanks. I got an advanced copy of it though, so I told him I'd send it to him. He's like, no man, bring it over, we'll watch it. So we watched the pilot and then we just were talking about work and he's telling me about Movie Poop Shoot and how he wants to turn it from this Ain't It Cool News parody into like a legitimate pop culture portal, kind of a one-stop place for movie, TV, music, and comic news, and asked if I wanted to run it. And so I immediately said yes. And then like after I left, I went to my car and had kind of a near panic attack where I'm like, I don't know how to run a website. Like, I've never done anything like that. And even more stressful is he said, well, we're launching in 2 weeks and CNN's going to cover it. And so don't fuck this up. Like, get this right. It's off and running. So I had to sort of figure out really quickly, not only how to tap some friends who knew how to do these things, but we all just scrambled to get it up and out in the world. And yeah, I mean, had a lot of fun with it. And that's kind of the site that then led me to meet comic creators, that then led me to IDW and kind of gave me a foothold in the comic industry. So, it all sort of traces back to, and I owe it all to Kevin.
Yeah, you stayed with the website for 4 years. You ran that website for 4 years. Comics 101 with Scott Tipton is what got me to start writing about comics. So,
Oh,
I'm like,
awesome. Yeah, that was like the one, like when Kevin decided he needed to largely pull the plug on Poop Shoot. At that point, I had already taken the job as editor-in-chief at IDW, and I was keeping both going concurrently, but it was killing me because both jobs were a lot of work and a lot of hours and everything. And so when Poop Shoot came to an end, it was fun to still continue the bits of the comic stuff with Scott. Um, but yeah, at that point, IDW had kind of become just such a full-time plus job that I don't think I would have really been able to continue movie Poop Shoot had Kevin even kept it going in the way it was.
yeah. How's your relationship with Kevin now?
I've only seen him twice since I left. Once at a friend's wedding, and then he did one of his podcasts in San Diego, and it happened to be on my wife's birthday, and so I brought her to that. And I think, you know, the podcast was more of a thing that I liked than was necessarily to her taste. So I think she's like, "Great present you got me." But it was cool because, you know, I saw Kevin there, and he like said a hello on air and all of that. And but otherwise, yeah, I haven't really seen him a lot because he's been so all over the place with podcasting, with directing TV shows, and just everything else he's doing now.
Yeah, it's like after Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, he was just like, you know what, I'm gonna do what I want.
Yeah,
It's
he's been really smart about that, of kind of just like feeding his audience and also not letting any direction that started to close off be a deterrent. Then he just, you know, if the films for whatever reason aren't finding the same traction that they used to, I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to podcast, I'm going to direct TV episodes, I'm going to relaunch He-Man. Like, he's been really smart about the way he's just navigated everything, and then kind of just made the Kevin Smith persona such a career unto itself.
yeah, because I think the most lucrative things for him since those movies have been his Q&As, right?
Probably,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean,
So
the, you know, when the podcast now can sort of sell out these big comedy clubs and everything, like it's pretty cool to see, just to watch all the different things that he's gotten up to.
you joined IDW in 2004. You were the second editor-in-chief. For those not in the know, what does an editor-in-chief do and how does it differ from an editor-editor?
Well, so what's funny is I've never been just an editor. Like, I've been an editor on specific books, but I'd never held the job of just editor prior to joining them as editor in chief. And so, like, I would occasionally do these panels at conventions, and people would talk about how to break into comics. I'm like, you just break in as the editor in chief of a publisher. That's all. But that's not the normal path. So I had a ton of like on the job learning to do, which is figuring out, yeah, what an editor does, how to navigate, you know, keeping all these books running, and figuring out what to publish next and everything. And so for me, editor in chief was, yeah, editor on specific books, which meant hiring talent, going through scripts with writers or proposals with writers to develop, you know, the storyline that would then be broken down into scripts, going through the layouts with artists, keeping everything on schedule, keeping everything on budget, and then even down to the granular stuff like copy editing, you know, going through and making sure there's no typos and all the ads are placed right, all the pages are in the right order, you know, just kind of all the nuts and bolts of helping prep a comic for print, while at the same time then figuring out, you know, what we're going to publish 3 months down the line, a year down the line. A lot of it became license acquisition, so going after things like the Hasbro properties, you know, and working on things from that side too. And so I just kind of had a foothold in and a say in just about every bit of the company's publishing efforts. So everything that the company decided to publish, I was involved in the deciding and the procuring and the, you know, hiring, whether it was talent or other editors to come in and help, and sort of onward from there.
What did you look for when looking at a proposal or looking for talent?
Um, kind of the same thing I do now, which is, if an idea isn't necessarily unique in the log line, you know, if it's just, I don't know, a vampire story or something, then you look for, is there a unique spin on that story? If, you know, if we all agree that there's only so many different types of stories, does this writer have a specific voice or a specific way of telling a story that makes it feel unique? And so that was always that was always kind of the underlying thing, was like, is this a story that we haven't seen before, or a way of telling the story we haven't seen before? And also, is it a story I'd want to read? Like, if I was a comic reader, does this feel like a thing that would have appeal to me, and therefore does it seem like it's a thing that would have appeal to a broad array of readers? And is it a book that will, help retailers business, and all those different things? And so I don't know, for me, like, the most fun is not only figuring out what this book will be, what the direction will be, but then also what's the right pairing of talent to really help it come to life. What's the right artist to go with this writer's pitch to really make this thing something even more than it seems on paper.
Is there a science behind putting together a writer and an artist?
There's a science behind convincing either the writer or the licensor that the artist that you want is not only the right artist, but making them feel like it's their choice. And so, because there's times when, like, I would look at something and I would just know, like, this artist has to be the guy that draws this. Gabriel Rodriguez has to be the guy that draws Lock and Key. A lot of people could do a great Lock and Key, but Gabriel's the guy that is going to make this book something even more than what it would be in somebody else's hands. And so what you do is you present 3 or 4 samples to the writer or to the licensor and say, here's a wide array of talents and styles. What do you think? And you just make sure that the other 3 aren't quite as good as the one you want. And so they're picking the one that seems kind of like the inevitable choice, but then you go, oh man, that's a great idea. Like, I love that. Yeah, I'm glad you chose that. Because you want everybody to feel like they have say, but at the same time, you also want to make sure that, like, the team is everything that you think it could be.
Yeah. I do the same thing at work.
You sort of have to. And I mean,
Yeah.
there are times when it doesn't work. There are times when on paper, like, the writer and the artist and the property and everything about it feels like there's no way this thing can fail. And then it just doesn't grab people the way you think it would. And I think that's kind of the sort of fun, arcane nature of comics, and that you think but sometimes you just don't. And other times you're like, yeah, this book's okay. I like it, but I don't know that it's going to really break through. And then it does. And it's like this completely pleasant surprise where you kind of realize that whatever you think it's a lot of guesswork involved.
Yeah. No, yeah, because every time I'm asked to like prepare like 3 options, I make sure one of them sucks. Right?
Yeah, it's like
'cause-
when, like, there was a card game when I was a kid, Old Maid, and you tried to give away the shitty card, and you make sure it just sits up a little higher in the hand, so the person somehow just feels inclined to grab that one. So you just make sure the sample you want, so the thing that you want to sell is a little bit better than the other options.
So in IDW, you proceeded over several properties, like a lot of them were licensed properties. I've always been curious about this because comics, as we know, it's doing much better now, but it's not an industry that makes a whole hell of a lot of money. So between talent and licensing fees, how does a licensed comic, make revenue, make profit?
I would say you're playing the long game. Well, you're playing a couple things on licensed books. So, like, when IDW first went after things like Angel, or certainly for the Transformers, which was very different than the other kinds of books IDW published at the time. It was largely a horror company, sort of built on the backs of Niles and Temple Smith's 30 Days of Night. And so there were a lot of other horror books to kind of build on that popularity. Transformers was very different than that, but it felt like right now we're only a horror comic publisher that horror fans are gravitating toward. If we do something like Transformers, that's got a much bigger audience. It's got sort of generations of fans. That's going to get people paying attention to IDW in ways that just doing more horror books won't. And so you kind of play that out in your mind too. Like, if we bring this property to us, is it going to really add luster and sort of expand what people think of the company? And then beyond that, you're also playing the long game of, like, with Transformers or with the Ninja Turtles. Yes, we could do a new series. We can launch that with good creators. That's going to sell to whatever degree it does. But there's also this extensive back catalog. And so you're kind of hedging your bets to make sure that there's lots of different ways to offset the higher cost of getting the license. So if we can sell the back catalog as hardcovers, as soft covers, as, I don't know, reprint comic books. You can do new series, you can do spin-offs, you can do follow-ups to old series. All these different kinds of things can really help offset the sort of upfront financial risk. But a lot of times it can take months, years to where you're finally at the break even and beyond point. So you just kind of make sure that these things that you're taking on not only allow that, sort of have a fan base that is going to be interested in all those things, but also it's just got to be a thing you like, because licenses are 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And if it's a thing you do just because you want to make money off it, like, it's going to be a miserable run. Because if you don't care, like, it just makes stuff feel like work. And so that was kind of always our initial thought was, well, does somebody here really care about this property enough to be its champion and to do a good job with it? Because we've all read a lot of bad licensed comics, and we know how those can just hurt a place's reputation or hurt the fans, who want to see an extension of their favorite property. And so it's got to be a thing that comes from a place of liking it and wanting to tell new stories. And then hopefully, the revenue is there as well.
Which is what do you think is easier to market or to manage, a licensed comic or a completely totally new comic?
Always the licensed comic, because immediately you can say, we're going to put out a new Ninja Turtles comic. And the fans that go, oh man, I bought that in '84, I loved it. Or I watched the animated series, I loved it. Or I watched the terrible movie with Vanilla Ice song. I don't love it, but I'd like to see what the comics are now. There's just so many iterations and so many, like I say, decades of fans, that there's going to be a wide array of people that are interested in what the new what that new series is. Whereas even something like Lock and Key, where you're like, I know this is great. I know Gabriel's a great artist. I know Joe's a great writer. The property is really interesting, but nobody's heard of it. And so they're going to be less inclined to pick it up than they are Batman, X-Men, Ninja Turtles, and so you kind of gotta really go out there and almost hand sell it, or you got to be really patient with it and whether a new title is kind of slow building of an audience, and then hopefully it arrives and becomes what Lock and Key has. But it requires more patience, and it requires a bit more of a sort of specific touch to make people aware of what this new thing is and why it's worth their time and their money.
What was it like discovering Joe Hill?
It was so exciting because it really just came about from this innocent place of reading a short story collection that I hadn't heard of the guy that wrote it, but me and the CEO at the time, Ted Adams, were both reading this book, and we're like, there's something about these stories that just feel kind of like I was talking about before, where it's like, on the surface, if you describe the high concept, you're like, oh, I know what that story is. And then you read the story, you're like, oh no, he did something totally different with this. And so it sort of had almost a Neil Gaiman-ish quality to the way he would tell his stories. And so then you start thinking, well, is he another Neil Gaiman? Is he a guy that could jump from prose to comics as easily as Neil seemed to do? And so we just reached out to see if he first wanted to maybe adapt some of his stories for comics, kind of trying to be wary of the fact that he's a prose writer, so he's got a day job. So if we just do adaptations, it won't be a huge burden to his schedule. And then Joe said, well, I'm not all that interested in that, but I have this idea for some new things. And so we ran these new ideas by us. And the one that really stood out was this one with the big creepy house and the magical keys and all of that. And so going from this kind of high concept with this new writer that we'd never heard of, to then, seeing what the book could become, and then, learning Joe's secret identity down the line became this fun bit.
You didn't know?
Didn't know at all. No.
Does he do that on purpose?
He did. He really wanted to make a name for himself as a writer on his talent, and not be given opportunities that his name would have provided, and always wonder if he didn't earn the way in. And so he spent a decade of toiling and being rejected like the rest of us get rejected, and didn't fall back on sort of an easier path. And so he could really feel like, all right, when they're reaching out to me, they're reaching out to me because I'm me, not to either try to get to my dad or try to, use the family surname as a way to market this book. And so Lock and Key was about to come out right around the same time 20th Century Ghosts. Heart-Shaped Box, his first novel, was launching. And I remember Joe said he was going to be on one of the morning shows, like Good Morning America or one of these shows. And so we thought, all right, well, let's tune in and see if the guy can, put a sentence together, see if he's personable and approachable enough to maybe have at a convention at some point. And he comes out and sits down, and the first thing they ask him is how it feels to be Stephen King's son. And we're go, holy shit, really? That's interesting. Had no idea. And
How'd
then
they
we
find
went
out?
about our, what's that?
How did they find out?
I don't know. I mean, I think it was starting to percolate at the time the book was coming out. So I don't know. I think the publisher was very good about respecting his wishes too, but I think you can only keep stuff quiet for so long. So for us, it was like a fun bit of intrigue to Joe's background, but we didn't immediately pivot and start saying, from the son of or anything like that. It was always author Joe Hill. But yeah, that became an interesting thing because then it led to me working with Stephen on a few projects too.
Now that everyone knows who he is, do you think he just keeps that pseudonym? Because otherwise he'd be Joe King, and it's a weird.
Exactly. You don't want somebody coming up to you saying, "You must be Joe King." But I think also he did such a good job of building, Joe Hill as a writer that it's really cool now that not only is he very open to talking about, the family and their relationships, and they've done stories together, but now, Stephen King will get asked about how it feels to be Joe Hill's dad, which I think is really cool that, they've each attained a level of fan interest and fame and all those kind of things through their writing that now, they can be playful with it and not have Joe feel like he has to hide from it. It's amazing to me that it's just such a family of letters. Joe's brother Owen is a very capable and New York Times best-selling writer in his own right, and Joe's kids are doing some interesting things that I think at some point maybe the kids have to then go by the King surname so they don't get, oh, you're Joe Hill's son, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's there's a ton of talent in that family, and I love that they're all such wonderful people too. And it's just like all of the boxes you would like to check on the people you want to work with. They check them.
In 2006, you were promoted to publisher. What is the difference between editor-in-chief and publisher? What are your added responsibilities?
So editor-in-chief is largely tasked with figuring out the direction of the publishing line, whereas publisher, you're largely tasked with figuring out how to maximize the revenue, like to your earlier question, on anything you publish. And so like if me as editor-in-chief is saying we're going to do Lock and Key and it's going to be with this writer and this artist, here's why it's appealing. Me as publisher then goes, okay, well, we should do that in this format. We should offer it this way. We should collect it this way. We should, you know what I mean? Sort of trying to figure out the best ways to maximize the opportunity. It becomes an unwieldy thing to try to manage those two sides at the same time. Like they're both really needing to be full-time jobs. And so I did the best I could to kind of see to both of those needs at the time. And then also later when I was holding both of those roles in a much larger company, there at that point, IDW was like 70 people. And I was chief creative officer too, which is a whole other thing. And it becomes an unwieldy proposition to try to do all those things well. But at the time anyway, 2006, yeah, that's what I was doing, was trying to figure out what we're going to publish and with whom, and then how to sort of maximize the opportunities of each of the things that we publish.
You were there when Scott Dunbier left DC and went over to IDW, and he brought over the idea for the artists editions. What was there any pushback? Did you guys give him any pushback on that idea?
No, but who did is Paul Levitz at DC. And I love that Paul Levitz gave him pushback because that was a format and approach that Scott wanted to do for years. Scott was an art dealer before he really worked in comics. And so he's long known about the value of, and he appreciates the original art in ways that not only do few people sort of have that same interest in and sort of knowledge of, but he also knows all the artists who have kept the original art. Like he's in a very unique position to where he could actually track down enough art to make, something like 60 artist editions now. So he wanted to do that with DC's books. And, DC, it's kind of like Marvel, are in the business of putting out a lot of monthly books. And so the stuff that's very costly up front and very time consuming, I get why their sort of respective business models aren't necessarily equipped to do that, and I'm really glad they're not, because for IDW it was all about the care, the sort of legacy preservation, the production values, like all the things that those books require were already a thing that we wanted the company to provide. And so yeah, like that was one of the catalysts for Scott sort of moving away from DC and then coming to IDW, was finding a place where he could finally do these books. And I love that he was able to then, we could get DC to come on board and let us do some books with them. So Scott kind of got his way after all.
And you were also there when Walt Simonson came in and started doing Ragnarok. So Walt Simonson, true or false, has just gotten better with time.
There's a select few people that sort of not only never miss a step or lose a step, but do get better. Yeah, there's Walter. I think John Severin was one of those guys. I think Joe Kubert was one of those guys. Bernie may not have produced to the same speed when he was young, Bernie Wrightson, but his work was just as good, and so they're like, Walter is not only as good as he's ever been, but he's just one of the greatest people that I've ever had the good experience to get to know and work with. And that's entirely a testament to Scott. Scott had a relationship with Walter at DC, so he brought Walter in to do Ragnarok, and like just getting to know and hang out with and spend time with Walt and Wheezy is amazing to me. Like, I have Thor 337 elsewhere in this rack, and like Walter's one of those guys too, sort of like Byrne and Perez, that I've just always held in just the highest possible regard, because what they did, is make some of the comics that have meant the most to me throughout my entire life. And so to get to, experience those people directly and see that they're as kind and sweet and fun to work with as they are talented is just, you just kind of get amazed sometimes when you realize you're working with these people that you used to only ever be lucky enough to read their stuff.
Yeah, I still think his Thor run is the greatest of all time. And I've read Kirby's, I've read Jason Aaron's, and I'm like, I still think Walt is the king of it. But then when I was reading Ragnarok, I was like, setting aside the prior attachment to the Marvel characters, I was like, oh my God, I think he got better.
Yeah. I mean,
this is insane.
Forget like 83 when his Thor came out, he was in comics for maybe 10 years, and so he's still in a lot of ways, as he would say, like figuring out how to tell stories and what he wants to do with the visuals and how to sort of hone his craft. And so he's then had decades since then to do just that. So it's exciting that it's nothing like what he did on Thor. And yeah, like you say, in a lot of ways, the storytelling is better and more refined, and just, it's still just so exciting to be able to see a new Walt Simonson comic on the stands.
You left IDW in March 2018 to go to Skybound, and you came back to IDW in December 2018. This is where I turn into a hiring manager and be like, can you explain this gap in your resume?
Yeah, I know. So the gap is largely, there were some managerial changes at IDW at the time that took the company in a direction that I didn't think they should go. And I just felt like, okay, well, if that's the direction that they want to go, then maybe it's time, it was like 14 years. Maybe it's time that I've sort of outlived my effectiveness here and I should move on. And so, yeah, went to Skybound for under a year. And then IDW called back, and it became one of those things, kind of like when you get dumped by a girl and you're like, I want them back. I want them back to prove they were wrong, like. And so then when that girl calls and says, I was wrong, I want you back, like, you sit up and pay attention. And so I love Skybound. I think there could have been some really good, fun stuff there. But then when IDW called back and said, you were right, and we want you to take over as president and publisher and chief creative officer, will you come back? Like, it was one of those things where it sort of felt like unfinished business. And so I hated to leave Skybound so quickly because I think that's a great company, and I think Kirkman on down like really do good stuff and are good people and all of that. But IDW to me felt unfinished, and I wanted to see if there was more I could do to kind of push it in the direction that I thought we'd been headed for a long time, and so yeah, that was the rationale behind going back. So
And you
it
didn't
wasn't like I was hiding from the law or anything like that.
and you didn't stay too long either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So before we get to Syzygy,
Syzygy, but
Syzygy.
yeah.
Yeah, so what's it so when you're editing Lock and Key, like what how much back and forth do you still do with the creators at this point?
That one was total. So that like Lock and Key is a book that we've all agreed won't exist without all of the team, working on it together. And so, like I say, having to try to navigate those three roles of publisher and chief creative officer, which is kind of just an elevated version of editor in chief, really figuring out the long-term publishing plans and kind of the bigger publishing initiatives, and then editor in chief and then being the person that's managing a staff of 60 plus people was kind of an impossible thing. And I mean, people warned me that it would be potentially an impossible thing to manage, because those are largely 3 full-time plus, executive positions. And I kind of didn't want to hear any of that because I wanted to do the job. And so I was trying to do those things and also be the point person and the editor on stuff like Lock and Key. And so it just became a point that was so unwieldy and so just not manageable in the form it was in. And then you realize that a lot of where the company was headed, with some of the media things that they wanted to do was not really what I wanted out of a publishing division. So then it was like, all right, I think they really need to break these positions up and have the company be ultimately what the owners want. And so then it just became a thing of like, sometimes you can't go home again. And so, yeah, after about a year and a half of trying to navigate all those different roads, I just said, look, I want to stay overseeing Lock and Key in all ways that I can. And they graciously agreed to that. But otherwise, I think I had reached the end of the run as it existed. If that
There's nothing wrong with you.
explains
There's
it.
nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that. Yeah. As the executive producer of the TV show and having been one of the people who helped bring it to life, what was that
And
like?
executive producer. There are a lot of other executive producers who do a lot more of the hands-on work than I did. So a lot of it for me was just kind of being the guy that did what I could to ensure that the creator's story within the comics is met and sort of adapted or told in ways that don't betray the spirit of the comic, while understanding that the TV show is going to be its own thing and needs to be its own thing. And so I got kind of the fun part of getting to watch dailies or getting to go, visit set, read scripts early, but without having to do what some of the other producer roles entail, which is like manage budget, keep stuff on time and all of that. I didn't have to worry about that. I could just kind of have the fun parts of, being a producer.
Yeah, I like that you said that because that's such a weird fan complaint to me when they're like, "Oh, they didn't do exactly what happened in the comics." Because I'm like, then go read the comics.
I know, and if they did do exactly what you read in the comics, like sort of like Watchmen, people would find fault. There's almost no way to adapt something that's not going to alienate the fans. So you just really have to make it its own thing, kind of in the way that like when I was adapting Stephen King or Clive Barker, I felt presumptuous as hell because I would want to cut some of their dialogue or cut some of the scenes that don't really work in the same way in comic form as they did in prose form. And so I would go to these guys feeling very like tentative about it and nervously saying, "Hey, I want to kind of cut the scene." They're like, "Yeah, have at it. Make it what it needs to be to suit the format." And so Lock and Key needs to be its own thing as a TV series rather than just a, scene for scene remake of the comics.
Can you tell me about Syzygy?
Yeah, so Syzygy was a thing that I actually started with Ashley Wood, who was he's my partner in crime, like the artist and designer on a lot of things that I've done over the years at IDW. We did a horror magazine called Doomed. That was kind of like our tribute to the old eerie and creepy magazines. And then we did Zombies versus Robots, a number of series over the years. And so when I left IDW and was going to Skybound, we also started this little imprint that was going to be just our place to do just kind of the silliness that we wanted to do together that, maybe didn't feel right for other publishers. And we just wanted to do it without restraint. And so then I go back to IDW and I go, Ash, hey, I'm going back and I've got these 3 roles and I can't do this too. And so then it quickly went on hold. And so then when I told him, about IDW heading where it was heading, he said, well, let's do Syzygy now. It's time. And so after I left it, IDW, Image kindly called and said, if you want an imprint, like, come do it. We know what you do at this point. You've done it for long enough. Like, we know what your books will be. We want to offer you your own little corner and come do what you want to do. And so that's where, he and I launched Syzygy, and it's a thing where we're trying to do, it's hard to define what it is. And I've had a fair number of creators ask me like what we're looking for pitch wise. And my answer is sort of the frustrating, like, I don't know, whatever we like, whatever stands out to us. And that's kind of it. Like it's hard to say there's an art style or an aesthetic that suits us. So I just kind of point to let Ash be kind of the guiding lights. Like, Ash does stuff that is different than your traditional comic artist. It's kind of off kilter in its own way. It's we do stuff that kind of has its own, I don't know, sort of weird dark sense of humor to it, and we want stuff that kind of feels sort of similarly off kilter.
I get it. It's like the 90s serious entertainment.
Well, yeah, I just don't want to do stuff that like a title with super soldiers that you feel like you could pick up and it could be a Top Cow book or an IDW book or an Aftershock book or a Dark Horse book, or you want to do stuff that kind of feels like, all right, well, that I can see why that's there, because it doesn't necessarily fit too easily into the other people's buckets, for whatever that means.
I get it. So like you want to be the place where people would go if they didn't know where to go.
Yeah, right. Like if you're sort of the outcast amongst your friends, or you can't quite make this thing work elsewhere, but it's got something cool and workable, maybe it fits with what we're doing. And that said, like, we certainly let off with a traditional book in the form of a Joe Hill adaptation. But even then, like working with somebody like Zoe Thorogood on the art, Zoe's got a style that is kind of, I don't know if off kilter is the right description, but it's very organic. It's very sort of her own thing that's not trying to be like superhero books or sort of I don't know what's kind of the commonly accepted sort of mainstream comic styles. And that really appealed to me, that sort of sensibility that gives it a flavor and a look and a feel that sets it apart from like other more traditional adaptations.
Can you explain the name?
Syzygy?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because the 3 things that I heard from people when I told them the name of it was, that's a terrible name because we can't spell it, we can't pronounce it, and we can't define it. And that's kind of been a staple of Ash Wood's books throughout his career. We did a book called Darrain Aventure that doesn't really have any meaning in French, even though it sort of looks like a French expression. And his art books always have these weird names. And so he said, I want to call it Syzygy. And so Syzygy is this kind of cosmic term that involves sort of celestial bodies revolving around each other and making each other stronger. And so definition wise, it fits, but otherwise it's just kind of a weird word that Ash liked. And so, I knew the name from 2 things. One, there was an X-Files episode, a really good one called Syzygy. And there was a character in this old Jim Starlin series called Dreadstar, this sort of magician character, this mystic called Syzygy. And so I was like, yeah, I like that. It's fine. It's better, I don't know, something too traditional may not necessarily define what this is. And so I think people going, that name is kind of weird. Like, yeah, that sort of sums it up.
What do you have coming down the pipe?
So Rain, this adaptation of the Joe Hill story with David Bohr and Zoe Thorogood, is the first thing that we launched. Next month, Ash and I are doing Zombies versus Robots, where we're reissuing some of the old stories we did together that, you know, a very small audience saw at the time, but we're also adding a lot of new stories, new content, covers, backup strips, you know, sort of a fake history of the strip that runs throughout the entirety of the comic industry's history, in sort of a goofy way. So we're doing that, and we're doing a few art books with Ash, and then there's a lot of things that are kind of in the percolating stage that haven't quite been announced yet, because we're trying to make sure that anything that we announce, anything we solicit, is far enough along that it's going to ship on time every issue, because that was one thing that not only did we not always do in the past, but was a thing that at Skybound was very important to Kirkman. You know, Kirkman was a guy that was very in touch with his inner comic fan of wanting a book to be there every month, so you know what to expect and you're not left hanging. And so Kirkman solicits books when he's got a few issues done. Image prefers to have books listed when there's a few issues done. And so we're trying to follow suit on that too, is making sure that anything that we solicit or talk about, we know it's well in hand and on track and gonna come out on time every month. Because I think that's really the only way to sort of help provide retailers and consumers any kind of consistency. And I think just letting stuff slip, as stuff too often does now, is just not helpful to the industry. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's a bunch more stuff that's in the works.
Good luck. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.